There comes a moment in life when the world you've constructed around you so carefully, so confidently folds in on itself. It does not explode, nor collapse with the drama one might expect. It simply folds, quietly, unceremoniously, like a page turning in a book you didn't realize was about to end. For me, that moment came in the late summer of 1978. I remember the sun casting long, sterile shadows across the tiled floor of my office on the 14th floor of Methodist Hospital. The air held the faint, persistent hum of fluorescent lights, and through the thick windows the city moved unaware beneath me. I was 49. President of the hospital, a physician respected in my field, consumed by a life of medicine achievement and ceaseless responsibility. 12-hour days were routine. Titles were plentiful, and rest was an afterthought I rarely entertained. My life was by all external accounts well built, strong, forward-moving, until the pain began. At first it was subtle, a persistent ache in the back of my skull, then a dull pressure in the ribs and unexplained fatigue that no amount of coffee could erase. I dismissed it as stress, as overwork, as the price of ambition. But I knew. Somewhere deep in the cellular wisdom, every doctor learns to quiet. I knew. Tests followed. Scans, biopsies, a quiet meeting with a colleague who had rehearsed such conversations hundreds of times. Except this time, the charts bore my name. The diagnosis was advanced metastatic bone cancer. The prognosis was terminal. Months, maybe a year, if I was lucky. There is something uniquely harrowing about hearing the sentence from within the walls of your own hospital from the mouths of men and women you mentored, trusted, laughed with in conference rooms. I had spent years delivering hard truths to patients, tempering their fear with empathy and measured hope. I had signed death certificates, spoken to grieving families, held hands through final breaths. But none of that prepares you for your own ending. Not when it arrives in the same voice you used to speak it to others. I did not cry. I did not scream. Instead, I returned to my office, closed the door, and sat in the silence. Around me were accolades, diplomas, leather-bound journals, photographs from conferences and ceremonies, tokens of a life spent building, fixing, healing. None of them spoke, none of them offered comfort. The silence did. Because in it, I met the truth. I was no longer the doctor. I was the patient. And I was dying. I submitted to treatment with the same professionalism I had once admired in others. Chemotherapy began. My hair fell. Nausea and exhaustion became constant companions. Friends and colleagues offered support, but I could see the quiet resignation behind their eyes. I knew what they knew: the medicine wasn't working. The cancer had no intention of slowing. Nights became longer. Sleep evaded me. I would stare at the ceiling, the glow of city lights flickering faintly through the curtains, and wonder how a life so full could feel so hollow. The irony wasn't lost on me. A healer unable to heal himself. A man of science defeated by the body he had trusted implicitly. Then something strange happened. It was small, inconsequential perhaps, a conversation with two strangers I happened to ride with in a car. They spoke of food not as comfort, but as medicine, of balance, of energy, of something called Macrobiotics. I laughed, politely but firmly. I was a man of evidence, of peer-reviewed journals, not seaweed and brown rice. But later that week, alone in my apartment, a book arrived, Zen Macrobiotics, by George Osawa. I don't remember ordering it. I don't recall why I opened it, but I did. And, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I read every word. Something stirred. Not belief, not yet, but curiosity, a whisper within the noise. What if I had overlooked something? What if healing wasn't always aggressive, clinical, chemical? What if healing could be quiet? I did not find faith in a sudden burst of revelation. It crept in slowly over sleepless nights and restless dawns. I began to wonder if life, true, vibrant, unfiltered life, was trying to call me back. Not with pills or scans or protocols, but with simplicity, with slowness, with bowls of miso soup and long, mindful breaths, with grains and stillness and a different kind of knowing. This is not a miracle tale. I do not offer it as proof or prescription. It is simply the truth as I lived it. A journey not from illness to cure, but from noise to clarity, from resignation to possibility, from death to life. I had always believed that knowledge granted immunity, not from disease itself perhaps, but from the fear of it. I thought that understanding anatomy pathology, the arcane vocabulary of diagnosis and prognosis, insulated me from the helplessness I had seen in so many patients. I was wrong. It began, as many endings do, with something small, a faint ache behind my eyes, fatigue that clung to me long after a full night's sleep. I blamed the hospital hours, the administration, the board meetings stacked after a 12-hour shift. I dismissed it the way doctors often dismiss themselves rationally, efficiently, foolishly. When the pain in my ribs grew sharper, I ordered a scan. Not because I feared anything serious, but because I wanted to eliminate the inconvenience. Even now, I remember the silence in the imaging room. The technician's professional tone, the way her eyes avoided mine for a second too long. The way the films developed like a slow confession. White shadows where there should be none. Islands of bone lit too brightly as though burning from within. I didn't need a radiologist. I read the scan myself, and still I waited for someone else to say it. The diagnosis arrived in a manila folder. Inside, a verdict typed in clinical detachment stage 4, metastatic bone cancer. The words were clear, unembellished, unemotional. They were just facts, but they rang in my ears like a sentence passed down from some ancient court. Final. Inarguable. My colleague John sat across from me in my own office, hands folded neatly, his mouth drawing slow shapes around words meant to comfort. I heard none of them, only the summary, the unspoken bottom line. There is no cure, there is no return. I thanked him, politely. I even managed a half smile. We shook hands like businessmen concluding a difficult deal. When he left, I stood at the window and looked down at the city. Cars moved like cells through arteries of traffic. People rushed from place to place, unknowing, unbothered. Life continued. My own had been quietly subtracted. That night, I stayed in the office long after the lights on the other floors had gone dark. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply sat, feeling my body from the inside as if trying to measure the damage to speak to it directly. But there was no answer. Only a steady, hollow ache in my chest. It is one thing to face death when it comes quickly, a car crash, a heart attack, a sudden rupture of the ordinary. But to face it slowly, with time enough to imagine every step of your own deterioration, every stage of decline. That is another kind of death entirely. A rehearsal, a cruel extended preview of your own unraveling. In the following days, I became a ghost inside my own life. I walked the halls of Methodist Hospital in my white coat, greeted patients and residents, attended meetings. I smiled at nurses and answered calls. But all of it felt like performance. I was playing the part of a man who still belonged in the world of the living. Inside, I was already receding. I began chemotherapy as recommended. The protocol was aggressive as it needed to be. My body resisted in every way it knew how. The nausea came in waves, rendering meals impossible. My hair thinned and drifted away in the shower like feathers lost to wind. My muscles weakened. I moved slower, thought slower, slept less. And in the cruelest irony, I still felt the pain. Always the pain. Every new test brought new decline. Every scan mapped the cancer's advance like an enemy marking territory. I read the results myself. There was no comfort in knowledge now, only the bitter confirmation that I was losing. The people around me responded as best they could. Colleagues offered professional sympathy, which I accepted with practiced gratitude. Friends visited less often. Not out of neglect, but out of discomfort. I was no longer Dr. Sattilaro, the administrator, the mentor, the charismatic presence at board dinners. I was a mirror held up too close to their own mortality. At home, I began to reduce. First in appetite, then in routine. I stopped reading medical journals. They felt irrelevant. I no longer cared about policy debates or departmental reforms. I could barely bring myself to return calls. Time became soft around the edges, stretching and folding without pattern. Sleep came in shallow bursts. I would lie awake in the dark, listening to the city sigh outside my window, my chest rising and falling with an effort that felt foreign. I would imagine the cancer inside me silent, industrious, relentless, doing its work while I lay still. It did not sleep. It did not tire. It was purposeful, and it was winning. In the hospital, I noticed how quickly I had transitioned from authority to burden. The nurses, always kind, now spoke with a different tone, one reserved for the terminal. Gentle. Controlled. I knew it well. I had used it myself. They were trained to comfort without offering false hope. I respected that, but I hated it. I had prided myself for years on never fearing death. But that was the pride of a man who had never been asked to stand before it. Now that I stood at the edge, I saw not a doorway but a void. What scared me was not pain or even dying itself. It was the possibility that all I had done, all I had been, would simply vanish undocumented, unremembered. A footnote in a closed chart. In rare moments, I found myself bargaining not with God, for I was not a religious man, but with the idea of continuation. If I could have just 5 more years, enough to finish the projects, the papers, to mend a few broken friendships. Enough time to explain myself to those who might misunderstand. Enough time to find a reason why it had come to this. But no bargains were struck. My condition continued its downward slope. Treatment by all clinical measures had failed. There was discussion of palliative care. I was asked if I had made arrangements. I had not. The loneliness of those days cannot be overstated. It is a particular kind of isolation to be dying while surrounded by the instruments of healing, the beeping monitors, the polished instruments, the antiseptic smell, all of it familiar, all of it useless now. I knew too much to believe in miracles, and yet I longed for one. I kept working sporadically, attending a few meetings, offering advice where I could. But I no longer spoke of the future. I avoided the calendar. I avoided mirrors. I no longer recognized the man who looked back at me, his skin gray, his eyes clouded by fatigue and fear. And then one day, something broke. Not physically, but in my spirit. A kind of quiet collapse. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't fall to the floor or wail into the night. I simply sat at the edge of my bed long after the sun had risen, unable to move. I sat there for hours, unmoving, untouched by hunger or urgency or pain. Just still. In that stillness, something began to stir, not hope, not yet, but space. A tiny breath of silence between the roars of despair. I didn't recognize it then, but it was the beginning of a question I had never dared to ask. What if there was another way? There is a peculiar cruelty in continuing to live while knowing you are dying. Not in the sense that all lives move inevitably toward death, but in the way that death, once named and scheduled, takes up residence beside you. It sits in the passenger seat of your days, quietly observing, saying nothing, but never looking away. Chemotherapy began in a haze of optimism borrowed from the people around me. Friends, colleagues, nurses, they said the right things. They spoke of statistics and protocols, of possibilities and response rates. They meant well, but I knew too much. I knew the numbers behind their words. I had seen too many charts like mine. My hope, if you could call it that, was not built on belief, but on compliance. I would do as told. I would endure, because that's what doctors do. The first few sessions were almost tolerable. A controlled discomfort, a sense of motion. Something was being done. The infusion rooms were painted in soft colors, staffed by kind professionals. Magazines sat unread on coffee tables. I remember looking around at the other patients, at their hands curled loosely on blankets, their eyes fixed on middle distance. We were passengers on the same train moving toward different versions of the same end. The side effects came quickly. Nausea first, then exhaustion that pressed into my bones like weight. My mouth turned dry and metallic. I began to avoid mirrors as the lines on my face deepened and my skin took on a gray pallor. My hair thinned. Eventually, I shaved my head not out of boldness but because I could not bear to watch it fall. Sleep became fragmented, more like short bursts of unconsciousness than rest. I would wake drenched in sweat, my body trembling from dreams I could not remember. The sheets felt foreign against my skin. Even in stillness I ached. Food lost its meaning. The appetite once so closely tied to joy and comfort disappeared. I picked at meals, forcing bites out of duty. My weight dropped. My muscles atrophied. The body that had once powered through back-to-back surgeries and late-night meetings now trembled under the effort of climbing stairs. My world shrank. I stopped attending meetings. I no longer cared about hospital memos or committee updates. Mail piled on the counter. The phone rang less often. People unsure of what to say said nothing. Their absence was not cruelty, it was fear. I had become a reminder. I understood. The city outside remained alive in ways I no longer was. I would sit by the window and watch pedestrians hurry along the sidewalks, jackets tight against wind faces set in daily purpose. Buses hissed to stops. Horns called out in the distance. Lights changed from green to red to green again. The rhythm of the world continued perfectly indifferent. That indifference cut deeper than I expected. To realize that life does not pause for your suffering, that it carries on in its vivid, bustling insistence, is both comforting and devastating. I was dying, and yet the world went on selling newspapers and making appointments and baking bread. I was dying in the middle of life. Hospitals are strange places for the dying. They are designed for healing, for urgency, for intervention. Even in palliative wings, the smell of antiseptic clings to every surface. Machines beep with vigilance. Nurses move with practiced purpose. It is not a place for stillness, and yet stillness was all I had. I would lie in the bed, my own body foreign to me, riddled with pain I could neither explain nor relieve, and feel myself fading. Not in one dramatic swoop, but in the slow erosion of self. I forgot names, lost interest in books, stared too long at blank walls. Time blurred. Days had no edges. Morning and night traded places without ceremony. Visitors came and went. Some brought flowers, others tried conversation. I nodded, smiled, offered fragments of sentences that floated between us like dry leaves. They meant well, but I could feel them withdrawing, not out of disinterest, but because I no longer belonged to their world. I was slipping into something else, and they could not follow. In the deepest part of that season, I remember a moment not grand, not poetic, but clear. I was sitting at the edge of the bed in my apartment. The morning light was dull, filtered through the curtains. My robe hung loosely from my shoulders. The coffee had gone cold beside me. I had been there unmoving for hours. In that moment, I understood something I had resisted. I was no longer afraid of dying. I was afraid of continuing to live this way. Dying at least offered finality. But this twilight state of deterioration, of existing without momentum, of being watched over but not touched, this was a kind of exile. I was still breathing, still functioning, but not truly living. My body, my memories, my connections. They were all receding. I was becoming a ghost long before my death certificate would be signed. In those days, the hospital visits became shorter, more perfunctory. The doctors, my peers, spoke in softer tones. Treatment options thinned. One of them kindly suggested I consider quality of life. Another offered the name of a counselor. I nodded. I understood. The unspoken sentence had been spoken again. We have done all we can. At home, the silence grew louder. I stopped turning on the television. Music felt intrusive. I preferred the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of leaves outside my window, the occasional creak of floorboards as if the apartment itself sighed with me. It was during one of these silent afternoons that I opened a box of old photographs. black and white stills from medical school, family dinners from decades ago, conferences, travel, smiles frozen in time. I looked at the young man I once was full of clarity, ambition, hunger. I did not envy him, but I grieved him. I grieved the version of myself that believed in control, in answers, in always knowing what to do. That man had no map for this territory. He would have looked for studies, protocols, trials. But here in this space between life and death, there were no maps. Only stillness, only breath, only the question, what now? The irony, of course, is that I had never felt more aware. Stripped of goals and plans and achievements, I was left only with awareness. Of pain, yes, but also of detail. The way light shifted on the walls, the softness of worn cotton, the smell of rain before it began, the sound of my own breathing. The fragile, fleeting miracle of it. One morning, during a routine follow-up, I found myself sitting across from a young resident. She was new, unsure of her voice, carefully balancing compassion and professionalism. She looked at my file, then at me, and said quietly, "How are you managing Dr. Sattilaro?" It was a question layered in code. How are you still here? How are you surviving this? I smiled faintly. I wanted to say I don't know, but instead I said something I hadn't planned. I think I'm waiting for what I didn't know, but the words rang true. I was waiting, not just for death, not anymore, for something else, for something that might rise out of this wreckage and show me that all was not lost. It was in hindsight the first seed of openness, a tiny crack in the wall I had built around myself. At the time, I didn't see it. I only felt the faintest shift, like a breeze stirring still air. The days continued, but something had changed. Not the pain, not the prognosis, but me. I had stopped fighting. Not out of surrender, but because fighting no longer felt like living. And in that quiet, in that strange middle ground between despair and peace, I became almost accidentally ready. Ready to hear something new. Ready to see a different way. Ready, without knowing it, to live. The day was unremarkable in every visible way. Overcast sky. Pavement damp with yesterday's rain. A soft wind blew leaves across the hospital parking lot, catching against curbs and swirling briefly before settling. I had finished another round of tests, more blood work, more imaging, more evidence that nothing was improving. My legs felt heavier than usual, and rather than call for a ride, I decided to walk. Perhaps I was delaying the silence of home, or perhaps I simply needed to feel the air again. Even the fatigue couldn't quite push back the pull of motion, however slow. I headed toward a side road that wound its way toward the city's outer edge where I knew taxis passed more frequently. I hadn't walked far before a small, weathered van pulled to the curb beside me. Two young men sat in the front. One leaned over and offered a smile through the open window. "Need a ride?" There was something disarming in his tone. Not eager, not insistent, just simple kindness. I hesitated only a second before nodding and stepping in. The van smelled faintly of cedar and something else I couldn't place, earthy unfamiliar. The driver was thin, his hair long tied behind his neck. The passenger beside him wore a wool sweater that had clearly seen many winters. Their conversation, which I had interrupted, resumed softly after a moment. They spoke of vegetables, of harvesting cycles, of something called daikon broth. I sat in silence, letting the words drift past me like water I had no desire to enter. Eventually, my illness came up. I didn't offer it. I rarely did any more. But the topic slipped into the space between us, natural as breath. I spoke simply, told them I had advanced bone cancer, that I had tried chemotherapy but it hadn't worked, that the doctors had done all they could, that I was waiting now. There was no pity in their faces, no dramatic reaction, just stillness. And then the one in the sweater turned slightly toward me. "You ever hear of macrobiotics?" The word caught in the air like a thread snagged on a nail. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard correctly. Macrobiotics, was this a supplement, a diet, a philosophy? I didn't answer. He continued. "It's a way of eating, a way of living. based on balance. Grains, seasonal vegetables, fermented foods. No sugar, no meat, no dairy, just what the body can actually use. Clean. Whole. I let out a small dry chuckle, not mocking, but weary. It was the laugh of a man who had been offered too many ideas too late. "I'm a physician," I said finally. "I've read studies. I've done the protocols. With respect, rice and soup aren't going to change what's growing in my spine." There was no offense taken. They nodded the way you do when someone's reaction is expected. "Just something to consider," the driver said quietly. "There are stories. Stories. The world is full of them. Anecdotes. Hopes wrapped in coincidence. Survivals dressed in ritual." I had spent a career trying to separate story from science, miracle from mechanism. Yet, here I was in the passenger seat of a stranger's van, my body failing despite all science. They dropped me off near my apartment. We exchanged no names, no phone numbers, just a simple farewell. As the van pulled away, I stood for a moment longer than necessary, watching the back tires roll into the distance until they disappeared around the corner. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of pain, it was always there, a steady companion, but because something in that conversation had stuck. Not the words themselves, but the absence of pressure. They hadn't tried to convince me. They hadn't challenged my knowledge. They had simply spoken. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in many weeks, my thoughts moved toward something that was not despair. I remembered one of them had mentioned a name, George Osawa, the founder, apparently, of this macrobiotic approach. I hadn't thought about him in years. The name stirred a distant memory from medical school, a debate in a hallway, someone waving a book with a red spine and a title I had dismissed before reading. In the morning, I searched my shelves. I didn't expect to find anything. Most of my library was textbooks, case studies, journals. But, tucked between a stack of research on cardiac disease and a conference proceedings binder, I found a slim volume with unfamiliar kanji on the cover. Zen Macrobiotics. How it had come into my possession, I couldn't remember. A gift. A misfile. Fate. I sat down in the kitchen, the sunlight slanting weakly across the table, and opened to the first page. The language was strange, poetic, not clinical. It spoke of yin and yang, of foods that warm and cool the body, of harmony between nature and what we consume. It was not a book of medicine, as I understood it, and yet it made sense in a different way. Not intellectually, but intuitively. I read it cover to cover in one sitting, not because I believed it, but because it didn't ask me to. It simply offered an idea that perhaps the body, when freed from burden, remembers how to heal. I sat there long after the final page, the book resting in my lap. Outside, a bird landed briefly on the railing and then flew off again. A pot of water left on the stove began to boil. It was too soon to call this hope. I didn't believe in hope anymore, not the way I used to, but it was a crack in the certainty I had worn like armor. For the first time since my diagnosis, I considered that my knowledge might not be complete. That there were forms of life and forms of healing that I had never been taught to see. No one had persuaded me. No miracle had occurred. The cancer was still in my bones. The pain was still real, but something had shifted. A door I hadn't known was closed had quietly opened. I didn't begin with conviction. Not with faith or clarity or even real belief. I began with nothing left to lose. The familiar paths had all led to the same dead end. The white coats, the scans, the chemo, the language of medicine I had once wielded with certainty, they had all gone quiet. I stood at the intersection of resignation and curiosity, as soft and unlikely as it was, leaned forward. I cleared my pantry. Out went the sugar, the coffee, the wine I no longer drank but had kept as a vestige of social ritual. The meats, the dairy, the frozen dinners, the bright plastic bottles of sauces and condiments that had long since lost their taste. What remained was space. Empty shelves, empty countertops. It felt in some strange way like a funeral for an old life. I didn't know how to cook, not really. I knew how to eat in restaurants. how to order takeout between meetings, how to stir cream into coffee while scanning patient files. But I didn't know how to listen to water as it boiled. I didn't know the scent of sesame oil heating slowly in a pan. I didn't know how rice sounded as it simmered soft, almost whispering. I bought a bag of short-grain brown rice. It was heavier than white rice, denser in the hand. I followed instructions from the book: rinse it 7 times, soak it overnight, cook it with a pinch of sea salt and a strip of kombu. I'd never heard of kombu before, but there it was, dark and leathery, a kind of seaweed that would soften into something quietly savory. I cooked it slowly. I waited. I had time now, more than I wanted. The kitchen, once a pass-through between obligations, became a place of stillness. As the rice cooked, I stood at the counter, hands resting on the edge, breathing in the steam. It smelled honest, earthy, humble, nothing like the clinical sterility of pills or the chemical sharpness of IV bags. I ate in silence, a bowl of brown rice, steamed vegetables, carrot, burdock root, daikon, a cup of miso soup. It was not indulgent, not thrilling, but it was warm. It was real, and in some quiet, almost imperceptible way, it was kind. I ate the same meal again that evening, then again the next morning. There was comfort in repetition, in simplicity, in knowing exactly what would enter my body and what it had taken to prepare it. I began to chew more slowly, 30 times, 50 times. The book encouraged this chew until the food becomes liquid. At first, it felt tedious, mechanical, but slowly I began to notice things I had never paid attention to. The subtle sweetness released by the rice, the faint bitterness in leafy greens, the way each bite left a gentle warmth in my chest. I was truly tasting for perhaps the first time in years. The days unfolded without hurry. I no longer tracked them by appointments or meetings. There were no deadlines, only daylight and hunger and the slow return of sensation. My body, still ravaged by disease, began to feel less foreign. Not better, not yet, but less hostile. As if the war inside me had lowered its volume by a fraction. I slept more deeply. Not always, not every night, but often enough that I noticed. The hours between midnight and dawn, once filled with tossing, and the ache of limbs began to soften. I would wake not refreshed, but less depleted. And that was enough. I stopped taking painkillers unless I truly needed them. I listened to the discomfort instead of silencing it. I noted when it came after eating too quickly, after skipping meals, after letting stress tighten my jaw. My body was speaking, not screaming as it had during chemotherapy, just speaking. I added walks to my routine. Just a few blocks at first, then a little farther. I chose quiet streets early in the morning or late in the afternoon. The air felt different, cleaner, or maybe I was simply noticing it. The way sunlight filtered through leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the rhythm of my own feet on the pavement. I began to notice other rhythms too, the arc of energy in a day, the way my hunger rose and fell, how certain foods made me feel lighter while others left a residue of fatigue. I kept a small notebook, not as a medical record, but as a kind of listening journal. A place to observe, not analyze. Some days were hard. Some mornings the fatigue returned like a wave, pulling me down before I could rise. There were moments of doubt, flashes of cynicism. I would open a journal article, see the cold statistics, and feel foolish. How could rice and soup and silence undo what had spread through my bones? But then I would remember nothing else had worked, and what I was doing now, it was not hurting me. In fact, it felt gentle. My body was no longer under attack. It was being offered something neutral, something nourishing. Not a weapon, but a balm. I began to meditate. Not formally. I didn't sit on cushions or chant. I simply allowed myself to be still, to sit at the window, eyes, soft breath slow, and be present with whatever rose. Sometimes it was pain, sometimes sorrow, sometimes nothing at all. I learned to stay, That, more than anything, became the anchor of this new way of living, not control, not force, but presence. People began to notice. The woman at the corner market asked if I had been on vacation. A neighbor commented that I looked more rested. My reflection in the mirror, still thin, still altered, seemed less haunted. I didn't call it healing. I didn't call it recovery. I didn't call it anything. I simply kept going. The meals became a ritual. Morning, miso rice and greens; at noon, soup again in the evening. Occasionally a cup of roasted barley tea. No sugar, no caffeine, no alcohol. The cravings faded sooner than I expected. My taste shifted. An apple tasted like dessert. A bite of pickled radish lit up my tongue. I no longer ate out. I no longer missed it. The rhythm of my days became soft, repetitive, sacred in their simplicity. Wake, breathe. Prepare food. Eat slowly. Walk. Rest. Read. Breathe again. I read more from Osawa and later from Michio Kushi. I didn't agree with everything. Some of it felt mystical, too abstract for my analytical mind. But the core truth, the idea that food is not separate from life, that what we consume becomes who we are, that truth settled in my bones. I began to believe not in macrobiotics as dogma, but in my own capacity to live differently. That perhaps was the real shift. Not the food, not the rice or the miso or the vegetables, but the choice. The daily, deliberate act of living with care. Cancer had stripped me of my identity. This practice, this way of being, began to rebuild it, not as a doctor, not as a patient, but as a human being. I remember one evening clearly. The light had gone golden. The rice was done. I sat at the table, bowl in hand, and took a bite. It was warm, nutty, simple, and suddenly I wept. Not from sadness, not from joy, but from the profound, undeniable sense that I was alive, not merely surviving, not fighting, but participating, fully, consciously, without pretense. For years, I had seen patients as cases, symptoms, progress notes. I had offered them science, structure, strategy. Now I was learning something else entirely. The body is not a battleground. It is a garden, and gardens do not respond to war. They respond to care. The changes did not announce themselves. They came quietly without fanfare as subtle shifts in sensation and tone. A full night of sleep unbroken by pain. The absence of nausea in the morning. A calm clarity in my thoughts as I boiled water for rice. At first, I didn't trust them. I had learned not to expect relief, but slowly, the patterns became harder to dismiss. I no longer dreaded waking. Mornings arrived with a softness I hadn't felt in years. My body, though still thin and fragile, no longer screamed for attention. The sharp edges of pain had dulled. My breath was fuller, deeper. I could walk longer distances without needing to sit. I found myself humming sometimes without meaning to. It was not a miracle. It was not a reversal that came overnight like the lifting of a curse. It was more like a long-forgotten melody slowly returning note by note until I recognized the shape of it again. I continued the macrobiotic regimen not out of obligation, but because it felt like the most natural thing in the world. My meals remained simple. Brown rice, miso soup, steamed vegetables, seaweed. The occasional bowl of soft beans or a slice of daikon simmered in tamari. I cooked with care, ate with attention, and walked each day with a sense of gentle purpose. I returned to the hospital not as a patient, but as an observer. I visited the lab, reviewed my chart. There had been no formal schedule for reevaluation, but I requested one anyway. More out of curiosity than expectation. Part of me still needed to know. The first scan showed something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine: reduction. The tumors in my lungs had shrunk. The metastases in my liver were quiet. Not gone, not yet, but no longer advancing. The blood work, once chaotic, had stabilized. My inflammatory markers, previously off the charts, had returned to near normal. My immune system had awakened. My colleagues were puzzled. They asked about alternative therapies, medications I hadn't disclosed. I told them the truth. Brown rice, miso, seaweed, rest, stillness. They smiled politely. I recognized the smile. I had worn it once myself back when I believed that only data mattered, only protocols had power. They couldn't explain it. And to be honest, neither could I. But I could feel it. In my bones, in my breath, in the soft expansion of my chest as I walked beneath trees I had once ignored. I was healing. 2 months later, a follow-up scan showed no visible signs of cancer in my lungs. 3 months after that, the lesions in my liver had resolved. The skeletal tumors had stopped progressing. Some had even regressed. I sat in the radiology office staring at the images, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But it wasn't about logic anymore. It was about presence, about the profound simplicity of being here alive, awake, engaged. I resumed some light work. At first, just reviewing administrative documents from home. Then, short meetings carefully paced. I no longer chased ambition. I no longer needed to prove anything. I was content to participate, to contribute, to witness. People noticed. My colleagues saw the color in my face, the steadiness in my gait. They commented on my voice. It had deepened somehow, grounded by breath. Patients who had once looked to me as an authority now saw something else, a survivor. Some of them asked what I had done. I told them gently. I didn't evangelize. I didn't make promises. I simply offered what I had learned, that healing is not always a war. Sometimes it's a return to simplicity, to balance, to the body's own intelligence. As the months passed, I began to feel not just alive, but fully inhabited. My senses sharpened. Food tasted vibrant. Music moved me in ways it hadn't before. I laughed more easily. I wept without shame. There was a tenderness in everything. I began to write, not because I thought the world needed another story of healing, but because I needed to speak, to name what had happened, to make sense of the journey from despair to vitality, to give shape to what had once been only darkness. The book began in fragments, notes scribbled on napkins, paragraphs scrawled in the margins of medical journals, memories that surfaced in the quiet hours before sleep. I wrote in the mornings while the rice simmered. I wrote in the evenings after my walk. The words came slowly, at first, then with urgency like water finding a path through stone. I called it Recalled by Life. Because that's what it felt like. Not a conquest, not an escape, but a summons. A gentle hand, reaching back to pull me from the brink. Not with force, but with invitation. Writing the book was an act of gratitude. For the strangers who had spoken softly of miso and grains. For the authors whose words had found me in my silence. For my own willingness, however reluctant, to listen. The response to the book was beyond anything I had imagined. Letters poured in from around the world. Patients, caregivers, doctors, skeptics, believers. They wrote not just to praise, but to share. Their stories, their doubts, their quiet hopes. Some adopted the macrobiotic way. Others simply began to eat more mindfully. Some changed nothing at all but wrote to say, "Thank you for reminding me that the body is not the enemy," and that perhaps was the greatest gift of this journey. I no longer saw my body as broken. I no longer feared it. I honored it for what it had endured, for what it had whispered, for how it had held on even when my mind had given up. There were still difficult days. Fatigue would visit. Old aches returned like distant thunder. But they no longer defined me. They were weather-passing, changeable, natural. I continued to live simply. I ate the same humble meals. I walked. I rested. I taught. I listened. One afternoon, a young medical student asked me, "Do you believe macrobiotics cured your cancer?" I paused. "No," I said. "I believe it reminded me how to live." Because healing, I had come to understand, is not the absence of disease. It is the presence of wholeness, of connection, of being deeply rooted in the moment, whatever that moment holds. I was no longer fighting for time. I was living in it. and life, once so distant, now sat beside me warm, unhurried, and vast. I did not live forever. No one does. That was never the point. After the book was published, life moved not in grand arcs, but in quiet circles. The days unfolded with rhythm, mornings filled with the scent of miso and steam rising from a pot of rice, evenings closed with the hum of a quiet room and the breath of sleep. I taught when asked. I listened more often. I shared my story not as doctrine, but as memory. The years that followed were marked by simplicity, not the kind born of poverty or denial, but of deliberate peace. I let go of the excess I had once gathered: titles, meetings, obligations. What remained was what had always mattered most but was easiest to forget: stillness, warmth, the presence of now. And then, slowly as softly as it had retreated, the illness returned. There was no drama in its arrival, no sirens or alarms, just a heaviness in the bones, a tremor in the breath, a knowing. I went through the motions tests, scans, confirmation. Cancer again. The same kind, the same path. But I was not the same man. There was no panic, no rush for solutions, no flood of fear. I had already stood at the edge once. I had already been called back. And what I found in facing the possibility of dying again was not sorrow, but clarity. This time I would not fight. Not because I had surrendered, but because I no longer needed to win. My years since healing had not been borrowed time. They had been real time, vivid, conscious, awake. I had walked the length of seasons, watched leaves turn and fall, tasted the full bitterness and sweetness of being human. And now the arc was curving toward stillness once more. I continued to eat simply. I walked when I could. I sat by the window and watched the light change. My breath became shorter, my limbs slower. But the fear, the clenched fist of panic that had once gripped my chest, never returned. Friends visited. Some cried. Some didn't know what to say. I told them there was nothing to fix, nothing to mourn yet. My body was doing what bodies do. It was completing a sentence that had once been interrupted, and that too was natural. I often thought back to something I'd written in the book without fully understanding it at the time. Healing is not about conquering death. It's about remembering life. Now I knew exactly what it meant. Death was not the enemy. It was not a failure. It was not the opposite of healing. It was the final integration, the stillness at the end of breath, the place where all tension releases and the self dissolves into something wider. I spent much of my final year in quiet. Not silence, but quiet. A quiet filled with music, the low rustle of pages turning the gentle knock of wind against the glass. I wrote letters, short ones. Not to summarize my life or explain anything, just to say thank you, for presence, for kindness, for having met. I did not track the cancer's progress. I no longer needed proof of what I already felt. My body, once rebellious, had become a teacher. Its fatigue was sacred. Its limits were not burdens, but invitations to rest, to feel, to let go. There were moments of sadness, of course. Letting go is never without weight, but it was not the grief of unfinished business or unmet expectations. It was the soft ache of parting from something deeply loved. The night I knew would be my last, I did not speak. I lay in bed, propped against the pillows, the faint scent of miso still lingering in the air from a small bowl I had managed earlier. A candle flickered gently on the dresser. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees. I listened, to my breath, to the quiet rhythm of life continuing all around me, to the space between each moment, and then, very gently, I let go. There was no pain, no struggle, just release. Like the last note of a song dissolving into silence. People later called it peaceful. Some called it miraculous. Others said I died too young, that if I had done more, tried longer, lived cleaner, I might have stayed. But they missed the point. I had been given a second life, and I had lived it, not by defying death, but by welcoming life, not by clinging to control, but by allowing surrender. Not by fearing the end, but by loving the middle. This is not a story of overcoming. It is a story of opening. Opening to possibility, to humility, to the strange and sacred truth that sometimes the body knows the way back better than the mind. If I could whisper anything to those still searching, still clenching, still bracing against the inevitable, it would be this: do not fear the stillness. It is not the absence of life. It is where life waits to be heard. Do not rush to cure what you have not yet listened to. Do not fight what may be asking you to soften, and when the time comes, as it always will. May you meet death not as a punishment, but as a quiet, unexpected gift. A gentle hand on your shoulder saying, "You've lived. You may rest now."